Hey, welcome to the first public presentation by the network Representing Animals. Representing Animals is an initiative by Animal Society supported by various animal rights organizations worldwide. The goal of the network is to strengthen the political representation of animals. What does political representation of animals means? It means animals being properly represented in ministries, in parliaments, or in local institutions. Why should they be represented politically? It's because they are de facto affected by political decisions. Why exactly? And what is the current statu quo and how to change it to reach a proper representation of animals? That is what Jonathan Hoffmann will try to reply to today through this presentation. Jonathan Hoffmann is a researcher at the University of Warwick. We plan to broadcast similar presentations regularly. Some of them more theoretical like this one, and others more practical or on campaigns. If you want to follow our work, not to miss any of our content, subscribe to our newsletter, subscribe to this channel, and like the video. Thanks in advance for your support.
All right, so I'll be talking, as Thomas said, roughly for 45 minutes. We'll just see how it goes. And the topic is, as he said already, the representation of animals in politics, of non-human animals in politics. And I thought it's a good idea to start with the aim and scope of the presentation I'll be giving. And the main idea of this presentation is to give you a bit of an overview of the arguments that have been offered in academia in the last 20 years or so on why we ought to represent non-human animals and how to do that. I'll be very selective in providing these arguments because there is by now at least a growing literature, and I can only introduce a number of those arguments that have been made. I will also talk about the theoretical and conceptual challenges for representing non-human animals. And I will then briefly try to talk about how animals are currently represented in our political systems. Lastly, I want to suggest a few institutional measures that could bring us closer towards representing animals in politics. So the idea is that the talk provides you with some insights into a relatively small but growing field of academic study and equip you with some concepts so that you'll be able to make better choices about what kind of democratic institutions you want to advocate for when you think about including non-human animals in those institutions, in democracies. The agenda is the following. I have 5 steps. So maybe as a side note, before I start with that, my background is in analytical political philosophy. So I'm interested in how arguments are made, and I want to help clarify those arguments in discourses. As Thomas said, I've written my PhD at the University of Warwick on our duties towards the future and how to design institutions that will help us mitigate wrongful short-termism in democratic systems. But today I'll talk about the democratic inclusion of non-human animals. So first I'll talk about why and how non-human animals ought to be included. And this is what is often called ideal theory. So it's not about what is achievable here and now. I guess that many of you would like to hear an answer on that question, and I try to address it in the end briefly. But I would start with what some have called a realistic utopia. So imagine the rules for an ideal society that can nonetheless become ideal reality at some point. So this is not fiction or some utopian place, but thinking within the limits of our physical and psychological abilities and capabilities. Nonetheless, I can imagine that this will be a bit unfamiliar to some, insofar as this may seem a bit unattached to what is currently going on with regard to the relation of non-human animals and human animals. However, I believe that this is very helpful nonetheless, because to know what the ideal situation would be like helps us to actually criticize and to assess the status quo and to know in which direction we should be heading. In the second part of the talk, so steps 3 and 4, I try to talk about what is the status quo actually, and I want to make a few suggestions on how to change that, a few ideas what kinds of institutions could help us getting towards representing animals. So to start, I thought I briefly remind everyone of a few actually historical facts that we all, I guess, know about, but sometimes forget about in our daily lives. So it's not yet 200 years ago, it's 170 years ago that slavery was banned in the US. It's actually not that long. And it took another 100 years for racial segregation to come to an end in the US, formally at least. It is just a little more than 50 years ago that women actually got the right to vote in Switzerland. So, again, so that was in the 70s. It's not that long ago that women were not formally included and had no right to vote in Switzerland a bit more than 50 years ago. And since about 8 years ago, there are 2 members of the European Parliament from parties that aim to represent the interests of animals in that parliament. So the general trend that we may be able to observe here is that the moral circle widens. To give moral or political consideration to people who are not white, male, and rich is a relatively new phenomenon. Nowadays, many think about the consequences of the acts for coming generations, and a growing number of people also take into account the well-being or welfare of non-human animals. So this widening of the moral circle also has, I think, consequences about how we think about democracy. Specifically, this has an effect on how we think and who we think should be included, who should have a vote or be represented in decisions. So let's move on to democratic inclusion and how arguments for democratic inclusion work. Here's a very simple version of an argument for democratic inclusion. It is an argument made by the important democratic theorist Robert Dahl. And he suggests that everyone who is affected by a decision of a government should have the right to participate in that government. Dahl also noted a couple of years later, after he had written this quote that I just read out, that this very question of who actually decides, who gets to decide, is one of the questions that is rarely focused upon in democratic theory. So how do we actually think about and conceptualize who's part of the people of the demos, or as I would call it, the relationship plane? So most of the time this is taken for granted. It's citizens, of course, but why exactly is that? In the quote here, Dahl suggests a principle for determining who's part of the demos, which results in what I call a relationship claim. Everyone who is affected gets in. And all those who are within the relationship claim have a right to participate in that government. I call that second part of the argument the procedural entitlement. So because you're under relationship claim, you have a procedural entitlement. We need to dig a little bit deeper into these concepts because these 2 concepts will allow us a clearer picture in the end on why it is important to think about how to represent non-human animals and what actually follows from that. So let's talk about relationship claims a bit more. How to determine a relationship claim is now a hotly debated question in democratic theory. Many different principles have been suggested. And here's just a selection on the presentation. So it could be all citizens, all all who are legally subjected. It could be all who are coercively affected. There is being affected not only by legal, but for example, also economically coercive means. So for example, someone may force you to perform an act, right? Or it could be all who are causally affected. I call these principles of inclusion, and indeed many democratic theorists call these principles of inclusion. And these are just the ones that are most commonly suggested, so there are many more. But note that these have very different implications. So on a view where all citizens or all legally affected are part of the relationship claim, the number of those who are included is much smaller than if you apply the principle of all affected interests. For example, if you think about environmental policy, if you just say all who are legally subjected to that policy, this will often just be the people who live within the territory of a state. But if you think about all those who will be affected by that policy, this may have transnational or even global implications. And so all these people who would be affected, some living on the other side of the globe, would be holding some kind of procedural entitlement in that case. Note also that we can differentiate the relationship claim in other ways. So we can think about the object of the relationship claim. So is someone's life affected in a case? Is it health, subsistence, means of subsistence that is affected or that is legally relevant? We can also be affected in different ways. So the magnitude of a relationship claim matters, or may be mildly affected by a new policy or gravely affected. And it also matters whether you have been voluntarily affected or coercively affected. So if you made a business decision and this turns out badly, the responsibility may be a different one than if you were coercively forced to do something and this has negative effects on you. So who takes part in those decisions and who takes the responsibility may be different because of whether this has been voluntarily or not, a voluntary act or not. Let's now turn to the procedural entitlements. For an argument of democratic inclusion, you need both the relationship claim and the procedural entitlement. And an argument for democratic inclusion always gives us states which procedural entitlement would be in line with a specific relationship claim. So on the presentation, on the slide, you'll find a list of plausible procedural entitlements. The strongest one is direct democratic participation. So you get to vote in a decision, or you may have the right to take part in a referendum. On the next step of the ladder, you may have the right to be represented in a decision. So you can elect a person to represent you, but you can't be present. There could be different procedural entitlements, such as accountability mechanisms, transparency, public justification. So a government would have to make a statement if it would in some way affect you with the decision that it is taking, or it may have to consult you before it can take a decision because you would be affected or subjected by a policy, or you may just have to be considered, right? To give this a bit more practicality, let's look at another argument. So the following argument here that you can see on the slide is by Christian Skarganekeli, a political philosopher from Finland, I think. And he argues that future generations ought to be included in democratic decision. And what he proposes is that these have to be represented by what he calls proxy representatives. And the argument is that first, that future generations' lives, the lives of posterity, are affected, so they are part of the relationship claim. Then second, they are significantly affected by at least some decisions. So at least in these cases, they ought to be represented. Third, they are affected by democratic decisions, right? So that's a specific kind of decision process. And then he says, okay, because of that, because they are part of the relationship claim in this specific way, they ought to have a voice in the decision-making process. And as I said, later in the paper, he explains what that would mean for him, namely that 5 or 10% of the seats in parliament should be given to people representing future people. Now, how are the relationship claim and the procedural entitlement related to one another? It's not just a mix and match relationship. So you must give reasons for why you think that a specific procedural entitlement is in order if you if someone is a member of a relationship claim. Now, I think three things matter in this case. First, if you use a principle for determining who should be included in a decision, then you have to include everyone who would actually be included because of that principle. So otherwise, it would just be arbitrary. So you have to follow through. So all who are affected have to be included, not just some. You cannot just include some because you don't like them or because it would be difficult or costly to do so. Otherwise, it would feel kind of illegitimate. Secondly, the relation needs to be governed by some kind of proportionality. So the relation between the relationship claim and the procedural entitlement ought to be governed by proportionality, which could mean that if important objects are affected, such as your life or your means of subsistence, then you should have a more direct way to influence that decision, as in cases where your consumer choices are only mildly affected, for example. And thirdly, equality matters. So if two persons are affected to the same extent, so for example, significantly affected by a decision, and this will reduce their chances to obtain good education, then you cannot give a right to vote on that decision to one person and just a right to be consulted to the other person, right? They both need to be treated in the same way. What follows for this for the representation of non-human animals? We'll have a closer look now. So first, let us turn to a basic kind of argument that you could make for the inclusion of non-human animals in democracy. This could have the following form, for example. So the first premise or relationship claim is non-human animals are affected by democratic decisions made today. You could say relevantly or significantly affected, but in many cases they will be affected. Given this, the second premise is procedural entitlement. Non-human animals are entitled to representation in the political decisions made. So the conclusion follows: non-human animals ought to be represented in democratic decisions today. Now, in academic discourse, arguments like this are made more and more. However, they differ widely with regard to who exactly is part of the relationship claim, and also with regard to the procedural entitlement that is suggested. So what I want to do in the following is to give you a few examples of the kinds of arguments that have been offered in the academic discourse on the inclusion of non-human animals. So let's start with the arguments by Dobson and Eckersley. These are two arguments that have been offered about 20 years ago. In the case of Dobson and Eckersley, a bit less. And these originally come from an environmental perspective, so not necessarily an animal rights perspective. And you will see when we come to later arguments that these differ slightly. So let me read out Dobson's argument. If environmental policy affects transboundary populations and future generations, it also affects other species. One right granted to humans is the right to democracy, enshrined in Article 21 of the 1947 UN Declaration of Human Rights. It is not perhaps as far-fetched to claim a similar right on behalf of at least some species of animals. And later on in that paper, Dobson suggests, just as Eckerley did for future generations, he suggests proxy representatives. So few seats in parliament would be saved for representatives of animals. And he suggests that not everyone would elect those representatives, but only the members of the sustainability lobby, because he believes that these people would have the interests of animals more close to their heart than other people. Kind of similar argument has been made with regard to the structure, at least by Robin Eckersley. She writes, all those potentially affected by ecological risks should have some meaningful opportunity to participate or otherwise be represented in the making of the policies or decisions which generate such risks. And in consequence, Eckersley proposes to install what she calls an independent statutory environmental defenders office, which would bring legal actions on behalf of threatened species and habitats, and would engage in advocacy work in the public sphere. What you can notice here in both arguments is that it is not individual animals that Dobson and Eckersley think about. It's species, and the argument is more focused on the environment and ecological sphere as a whole, and it's working. Okay? But more recent arguments have focused on the rights of individual animals. And this is what I want to come to next. So Alistair Cochrane has written the important book Sentientist Politics. I think it was published in 2018. And there he suggests that we should apply some form of the all affected principle to determine the boundaries of the relationship claim. Thus, he thinks that all sentient animals that are affected by a decision hold a procedural entitlement in politics today. And the procedural entitlement that Cochrane favors is representation. And he suggests that animal representatives, as he quotes them, ought to represent as kind of trustee all animals living in their constituency. So we would have, as I understand it, constituent and geographical constituencies, just as we have them nowadays, but the animal representatives would have to represent all the interests of all those different animals living in that constituency. And Cochrane thinks that the best way to choose these representatives is not by election, but by installing a mini public setting. A mini public setting is a setting where you have a sortition process, so that randomly selected people, roughly representing the public, take part in that event, which is sometimes also called a citizens' assembly, and those people would elect the representatives of animals. He thinks that is better to do it this way, because these people would receive information and could have a discussion about what the interests of animals are, and would make better decisions as such than ordinary people without this setting would make. So Cochrane describes the job of these representatives as follows. These should act as trustees of the interests of animal members of the political community. In other words, their job should be to translate the interests of animals with whom we share a community of fate into their deliberations with other representatives over what is in the public good. Right. This is Cochrane's view, and I want to introduce you yet another view that has been very influential, and which in some way actually really started this political turn towards democratic inclusion in thinking about animal rights. And this is from the important book Zoopolis by Sue Donaldson and William Kimlicka. And they argued that it really depends on the kind of relationship that animals have with humans, what kind of procedural entitlement they actually have, and what kind of status they have. So they say that domesticated animals, such as cows or dogs, pigs, to name a few species here, they should have citizen status, because these are really dependent on living with humans in many cases. And citizen status means really that we have duties of justice towards them. They are full members of the community, and they provide, in their book, they provide a list of rights that these animals would have as a consequence. And one of those rights is to participate in politics and to be represented in politics. And because they have this relationship account of justice, they think that wild animals have very different rights. So they think about them in terms of sovereignty. So we should, if possible, just leave them alone and let them do what's good for them without interfering. But in such cases where they need assistance, for example, if environmental catastrophe happens. But so this account is really influenced by thinking about how humans relate to each other and how states relate to each other. So this is just the idea of non-intervention that you would find in international relations theory very often, where we say we should not interfere in other states because they have a right to govern themselves the way they want to govern themselves. Many other theorists would object here and say that wild animals are deeply affected by the way that we make politics, in a causal way, of course. So Cochrane, for example, objects to the argument that wild animals should be left sovereign and relatively independent from us, because we affect them in so many ways with our policies and with our actions, and causing climate change, for example, dangerous climate change. There's a third category that Donaldson and Kimlicka think about. This is what they call liminal animals. So animals that live actually within human-shaped habitats, such as our cities, but who are not domesticated. So raccoons, rabbits, squirrels come to mind, birds, many kinds of birds. And these are assigned what they call a denizen status. So they live among us, and they certainly have some rights. We have to treat them well, but these rights go not as far as with the citizen status. So they have a right to secure residency. You can't just simply get rats out of your house by simply killing them, for example, or bringing certain prey, other animals there that would ensure that the rats would simply move away. You have to find fair terms of reciprocity there. So you have to find opportunities for that, for these rats in the example, where they could live a better life, or at least as life as good as the one that they had in your house beforehand. So with regard to representation of animals, Kimlicka and Donaldson advance a view which is more demanding still than the one that Cochrane offers. And I assume that many of you will already have found that Cochrane's view is quite demanding. So let me read out the quote I have written on the slide. So we can elicit a range of expressions of preference to construct scripts of domesticated animals' interests, and can bring those into the political process to help determine ongoing fair terms of interaction. Domesticated animals, we argue, should be seen as co-citizens in this sense, with the right to be represented through forms of dependent agency in our political decision-making. So a bit like Cochrane, they also think of kind of trustee model where other people, humans, speak for these animals, but they say that there should be a deep kind of relationship between those representing animals and the representatives and the represented animals. And they continue by saying that domesticated animals have the capacity to participate in this process of democratic participation if assisted by those collaborators, as they call them, who have learned how to interpret their expressions or preferences. So this really breaks it down to the individual level. So they think not of representatives only representing a whole constituency, but sometimes representatives, collaborators representing individual animals. I want to give you one example that they use to make this point clearer. So they describe a situation of a public park, which had become a hangout for drug users and prostitutes, as they write, which had been abandoned by families and other intimidated by the presence of illegal activity. And they describe, or they take a quote from Walsh, who describes how this park has been taken back by an informal group of dog owners. And this situation is described as follows: these dog owners invested in improvements in security and used the presence of large off-leash dogs illegally to discourage less desirable users. Paradoxically, just as the park became more attractive again, other local residents signaled their desire to use the park, but objected to off-leash dogs, framing the issue as dogs versus kids. The dog owners prevailed in part by normalizing dogs as legitimate members of the American family and urban community. Like other urban dog parks, this park is now a distinct place for both people and animals, and remains a locus of grassroots participation in the governance of urban park and recreation facilities. So here you can see how as Kimlicka and Donaldson described it, the dogs actually played a crucial part in this by just being dogs, and in this way participated in what they would describe as a deliberative process where a negotiation happens between older stakeholders who have an interest in that park. And dogs, by being dogs and being allowed this to be in that park by the owners, allowed them to fulfill this function or participate in that deliberative process. Right. So having introduced you to a couple of proposals for how to represent animals, non-human animals, I want to note that there are a few theoretical and conceptual challenges, and want to introduce you to them. Some of them may be more worrisome than others, but I want to quickly mention a couple of them because they will be frequently raised when we think about how to include non-human animals. So the first question really is, why should we think about including non-human animals at all? Why not just stick to humans only? And the reasoning that is often given for that democracy is a rational process, and as such, only rational persons should be allowed to actually take part in this kind of process. In response, Kimlicka and Donaldson, for example, have argued that human animals are not as rational in all cases as we would like to claim, and as academics often claim, at least. And also, and this is very important to them and their argument, rationality is not a capacity that people have ongoingly through all their life, right? So children are not always acting rational, have to learn how to act rationally in the first place. Rationality may be impaired through illness at some point in your life, and you may lose it again when you're getting old. So if you would actually use this criterion, rationality, then a lot of humans would not have a right to be included in democratic decisions. So using rationality as a criterion would be very restrictive and would restrict many human animals from participating in politics. Of course, other criteria have been suggested also, but it turns out that this is really difficult. So whenever scientists or philosophers have come up with a new criterion that supposedly in one way or another demarcates human animals from non-human animals, it actually turns out that some non-human animals have this capacity, while some human animals do not have that capacity, right? So, for example, we now know that some animals are actually able to use symbols for communication, can write with assistance of computer. Many animals, non-human animals, can identify themselves in a mirror, have emotions, feelings, and a sense of morality also, or solidarity. So these approaches to the topic and the have not really worked out. There has not been found any criterion that would simply in some way demarcate, if you wanted actually to do that, non-human animals from human animals. Now, in the discourse on animal rights, there's agreement among wide agreement that sentience is the criterion that should be used to demarcate those who should be part of the relationship claim and those who should not be part of the relationship claim. So this is, for example, the answer given by Donaldson, Kim Leaker, Cochrane, and also by Martha Nussbaum in her new book. And notably, some environmental philosophers would disagree here. So they are making arguments that ecosystems, rivers, and plants and non-sentient animals should be included in democracy as well. So Eckersley and Dobson, those two philosophers that we read earlier, they are not only considering representing sentient animals, but a wider range of beings. So the reply by animal rights scholars here is that these things may have instrumental value, but you cannot wrong them in the same way that you can wrong an individual being that has its own way of being in the world, right? So sentience is the capacity for subjective experience. And in the words of Donaldson and Kim Leaker, you can ask whether there is someone home. And this would help you establish whether an animal is part of a relationship claim. A Kantian way of saying this would be to say that you ought not treat sentient animals or sentient beings as you ought to treat them as ends in themselves, not solely as means to an end. There's a second problem for the inclusion of animals, and this regards the question of legitimate representation. So with common views of representation, we normally would say there has to be someone authorizing a representative, holding accountable a representative, and there should be some kind of responsiveness between those represented and those representing. And there's a nice quote from Eckersley that really well confronts or points to this challenge. So if I want to speak on behalf of orange-bellied parrots, whose habitat will be destroyed by a proposed development, in what sense can I act as their political representative? I have no basis upon which to claim I am their delegate, because I have no mandate or authorization from parrots to speak on their behalf, and I cannot justify my arguments or actions to them. I have no expertise in ornithology, and I do not, I hope, resemble parrot or share or understand the parrot's view of the world to claim authority to speak on the basis of a common parent identity. All I can claim is that I care about the fate of parrots, right? In response to this, some philosophers have been thinking about other sources of legitimacy that can be tapped to legitimize the representation of non-human animals. And in particular, epistemic insights, so knowledge, may render someone speaking in the name of an animal more legitimate. So, for example, O'Neill writes that O'Neill thinks that experts who have studied a specific animal a lot should be able to advocate for that animal, to speak for that animal in certain decisions, right? And Exley adds to that it should not only be experts or traditional sources of knowledge that should be tapped, but also other people who may know a lot about these about specific animals because they have deep relations with these animals. So, for example, she talks about indigenous people, right? Or people who hold a moral authority. And this comes a bit closer again to the idea that we covered before, that Kimlicka and Donaldson hold, that you in some way have to deeply interact with specific animals to be able to represent them. There's a third problem that I want to note when it comes to representing animals, and this is a problem that has, or challenge that has not received the same amount of attention yet. And I think actually it's the one that is most pressing. So in many cases, we know that animals will be affected to the same extent as other animals. So specifically, non-human animals will be affected to the same extent as human animals. And the question that needs to be raised in that case is, why should non-human animals have less moral standing or hold a different kind of procedural entitlement than those human animals that will be affected by a certain decision, right? So often the argument is that there should be a certain number of representatives for human animals. As I said, for example, Dobson thinks a small number, 5% or so, proxy representatives. Others suggest an advocate or ombudsperson for animals. But there is no argument for proportional representation. So indeed, there are actually some remarks against proportionality. So, for example, Dobson suggests that future generations ought to be represented by proxies, as he suggests that animals should be represented by proxies. However, he notes that a system of proportional representation would give them rather too many representatives, right? If you think about the number of non-human animals or future people that we would have to represent if we would take it seriously and simply count the number of non-human animals represented, it would largely outnumber the number of representatives that we would have for human animals. So they would obviously be in the majority, right? But most philosophers think this is kind of absurd. So Nussbaum also writes, with animals, I think the solution need not and should not involve a proxy vote for every animal in every election. This would quickly become absurd. And from a practicality point of view, this is absolutely right. This would be very challenging to democracy as we know it, because the number of affected beings is just so large, right? However, we also need to think of reasons why we should actually allow for this this proportionality that is simply assumed by most authors without any argument, right? And without good reasons. We cannot simply say that they should not be represented in proportion and not as equals, right? So we should just do that, is the conclusion I personally favor, although of course this will be highly problematic from a practicality point of view. But then this would just mean that we, deeply have to think about what democracy actually means for us or can mean for us. With these rather theoretical remarks, I would like to come to an end of this part of the presentation and turn towards the more practical side. So it is not just the case that philosophers have been thinking about how to represent animals, but this is actually already happening in a number of cases. And over the last summer, I've tried to review those different kinds of approaches that have been taken by various institutions and advocates of animal rights in recent years. And I've tried to review this, and I will provide you a brief summary of what I've found. So, but a few notes of caution before I begin with that. So what I'll present is likely to be very biased towards Europe, just because I only speak German and English fluently. And so there's absolutely no claim of completeness, right? So the research I did was mainly through academic search engines, and I used some other search engines to find more examples, but this will just be limited and biased in some ways. So therefore, I'm very happy if you would point me towards other instances of representation of non-human animals. Because I'm really interested to know what else is going on, and I'm sure there's a lot more going on than I have found in this small study that I did. Good. So forgive me, I haven't really talked before about what representation actually is. I talked a lot about procedural entitlements, and representation is just one of those. But there are very different forms of representation in the end. And I want to just give you a very brief idea of what can be called representation. So there's formal representation. That is what we are most familiar with. So for example, an MP sitting in parliament elected by those she or he represents. There's deliberative representation where thoughts or ideas are represented, and thereby certain interests or perspectives will be represented in a discourse. There's performative and symbolic representation, such as a symbol on a map or a theater act, play, may in some way represent something else. And there's, as we learned earlier on, assisted or collaborative representation. And for the following, I will assume a view where all of these different kinds of representation are representation, right? So there's no limitation with regard to representation that is legitimate, right? Or which complies to very formal view of representation. Nonetheless, some of the instances I introduced to you may be just that. So first of all, there are political parties, right? At least in Europe, there are two political parties speaking in the name of animals, or at least aiming to do just that, in the European Parliament since 2014. And there are also a growing number of representatives of those parties in local, regional, and national parliaments. There is, as with most instances of representation that I'll talk about, rarely any empirical study about this. But in this case, there actually is. So in the Netherlands, there for I think more than 15 years now, there have been representatives of the Party for the Dieren, so the Party for the Animals, in Parliament. And what has been found is that the attention to issues in agriculture has increased sharply since then. So the number of speeches has risen, and it also played a more prominent role on the parliamentary agenda in general. So, and this is very likely down to the representatives of this party in that parliament. So we know that humans can assume the role of representatives of animals in some way, and that has an influence, at least in this case. There are other cases where we could talk about of representation. One is constitutions. So actually, a lot of states by now have adopted constitutional provisions for animal welfare. This is not the same as animal rights, though, so we have to be very careful here. But in Switzerland, you actually find that you not only have a strong animal welfare law, but you also have a state goal which actually declares or acknowledges, depends on what view you are on, that living beings have dignity. And dignity is something that is normally, or in all other constitutions I'm aware of, is only assigned or acknowledged towards human animals, right? In practice, though, Fink has found that animals are treated as means to an end in Switzerland nonetheless, right? So the ordinary law, the law below the constitutional law, is not different in Switzerland from many other European countries, and animals are treated the same, basically. So although there would be a very strong provision in the constitution, this is not actually used, and there could be huge leverage there if this was interpreted in a different way. Many other states, as I said, have animal welfare as a state goal. However, again, in practice, many reasons, nearly all reasons, will suffice to legitimately use, abuse, or kill animals in those states nonetheless. Then there's deliberation, as I said earlier. And actually, there are two kinds of deliberation here, actually. So there's deliberation between human and non-human animals, and there's deliberation amongst human animals about non-human animals, and both matter for representing non-human animals. So in the first case, we talked about this a bit when I introduced the thoughts of Kimlicka and Donaldson. We have human animals learning animal languages, and animals sometimes also learning human languages. So for example, there's a case of a primate who is actually able to use a computer to communicate with humans, with human animals. And some humans claim that, and I guess some do actually understand the languages of non-human animals. There are different ways to communicate with each other and with human animals. And there are also different ways to communicate between human and non-human animals. So there could be deliberation, material intervention. So for example, there's a case of a city in the Netherlands that had an ongoing negotiation, as they called it, with seagulls, because these would increasingly come to the city and go to the rubbish bins and use whatever they could find there. And they, in some way, try to communicate with the seagulls by not simply pushing them away or shooting them, as some other cities would do in such cases, but actually moving them step by step to other places by providing good alternatives for them. And as I said, there's also collaborative understanding, as I described earlier with Donaldson and Kimlicka. Then there's deliberation among human animals. And the examples that I found concern mini publics. I think I described earlier what mini publics are. You can also call them citizens' assemblies in many cases. So randomly assigned people from the whole demos, from the society, coming together, getting a lot of information on a specific topic. And in this case, the topic that has been discussed is xenotransplantation. So the use of organs of non-human animals for the benefit of human animals, so transplanting them. And this case was discussed by Citizens Assembly in Switzerland, the Netherlands, and in Canada. And we also have another case, it's a bit different, the Boyd Group, which discussed research ethics and animal rights, and is still going on in the UK. And Robert Garner, a political theorist and animal rights activist, has actually studied these instances. And he finds that deliberation can lead to changes in the position of participants, and that consensus is more likely to occur, and that these changes are more often than not in the direction of support for greater protection for animals. So that's actually really good. However, what he could not establish is that these changes occurred largely because of the provision of information rather than deliberation as such. So the good thing is, even just getting informed really helped people changing the direction towards more animal protective measures. The bad thing is we do not know whether it's information or deliberation that actually plays the bigger role here. And it could just be information. If it is deliberation, that would be really helpful also, because these mini publics have been used in other cases, and I'll talk about them in a second. Then we have designated ombudspersons, such as Tierschutzombudsperson in Austria and in some other cases, in some other states also. And since 2023, there's also on the federal level in Germany a Bundestierschutzbeauftragter, so also an advocate for animal welfare, not animal rights necessarily, in Germany. Again, I could not really find any empirical insights on whether their work is effective or not, so they rarely produce any public reports on what they've been doing. There's some suggestion that they mainly work in litigation, working on cases where the welfare of certain animals has been violated, but not on a grander scale of representing animals in other political areas. Then there are litigation cases. Maybe the best is to Google them or look YouTube videos about them, because these are quite insightful but rather difficult to explain. But the main point here is that the Supreme Courts in some cases, namely in Ecuador and in India, have ruled that certain practices have actually been illegal and should now be prohibited, that were against the welfare or rights of specific animals. Good. Lastly, there are some NGOs who actually claim, in some cases at least, to advocate for animal rights. But the majority of NGOs are concerned with animal welfare only. So most are not political. So for example, they maintain animal shelters or something like this. Many provide also information about animal welfare or biodiversity, but the number of NGOs that actually focus on political representation or changing the way policy is made is rather limited. Again, I could not find any empirical evidence on whether these NGOs have actually any effect, but I'm sure they actually have a huge potential. So in Germany alone, for example, about 1 million people are members in animal welfare organizations. If we could move those people from animal welfare to an animal rights view, which seems plausible, then there is huge leverage there. But again, no empirical insight on how they are actually representing animals in practice. So what to take away regarding the status quo? Non-human animals are represented in politics in many different ways. However, most types of representations that I've just been naming are still a niche phenomenon, and they are not well known to the wider public, and they are not well researched. And actually, none of the cases I just introduced comes close to what I described earlier when I talked about ideal representation of non-human animals. Animal representation as it currently is not inclusive, it is not proportional, it is not equal. And there's also no kind of responsiveness normally between the claimed representatives and those represented animals, or at least I could not find any such evidence. As I said, there's hardly any research on how effective these different measures are. And as such, there's a huge need for further studies on this and to study them more deeply, maybe comparatively and in depth. So where do we go from here? From my work on the representation of non-voice parties, there are still some things to learn, even if we don't have direct empirical insights on how to represent non-human animals as such. So, for example, we know that some practices are beneficial when we want to reduce certain biases, for example, bias to certain species, or if we want to avoid biases towards the near term, such as there's deliberation that helps rationalize arguments in some ways. It also helps to employ certain heuristics. So, for example, if you ask people to take the perspective of future people, that often makes them think and argue in a different way. And the same could be possible with animals too. Then a couple of times we came across mini publics and sortition. And sortition really helps because it takes away a lot of the political power play that is normally the case in politics, right? But if you assign random people to do the job, this gets taken out of the equation. What we know also what helps is defining clear roles and goals for representatives. So if those people speaking in the name of animals had a clear role definition, that would help them. And they could get some clearer role definitions by the help of, for example, mini publics or something like that. And we also know from what we've discussed earlier that some practices would enhance the legitimacy of animal representatives. So, for example, collaboration, as we learned from Donaldson and Kimlicka, or attentive observation may help. Also, consultation with people who know animals really well and who can offer other perspectives that would also raise the legitimacy of those who want to speak in the name of animals, such as NGOs. So let me come to an end by briefly saying something about the kinds of institutions that we could try to experiment with. So we could have something like animal impact assessments, right? Where draft laws have to be checked scientifically on their effects, on their consequences on animals. Or you could have policy performance indicators that would allow assessing policy effects once a policy is in place, the effects that it has on animals. Or you could have a citizens' assembly tasked with suggesting to the government how to represent animals in politics. Slight disclaimer here, Philip van Gaal, I think he's also present, and I want to try this actually, have a citizens' assembly, just do that. And we currently try to apply for funding for this. And we could also think about measures of civil disobedience. I know that some activists actually do engage in such activities. And I've been recently, or I'm currently actually teaching a class on civil disobedience. And what we find is there are many struggles for democratic inclusion of minority groups, of women, of Black people, only have been won because some people were willing actually to use form of political protest that called upon the majority and its sense of justice, or on the spirit of the Constitution, to actually change politics. So let's conclude. The gap between proper representation of animals and politics and how they are currently represented is vast. There's no silver bullet type of solution here, and there's no institution for the representation of animals to be recommended, because there's just so little research that we have to base such a recommendation on. Nonetheless, I've given you some ideas on where to go. It is also clear in which direction we need to be heading. All right, so we need to have more inclusive institutions for animals. And we should and that's my last point here, think about the potential for cooperation with other interest groups. For example, the sustainability lobby, the lobby for future people, and the environmental lobby all share some goals with the animal rights movement and with the idea of including non-human animals in politics. Thank you for your time and interest, and I think I spoke quite a bit too long here, but I'm very much looking forward to your questions